Hello, everyone, and welcome. World War I and two great Christian authors. That is the focus of our conversation today, and I'm very happy to have with us Joe Loconte, author, Associate Professor of History at King's College in New York. Thank you for being here.
Ben, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
You recently spoke at an event here in Nashville, and here was the title of the speech, A Hobbit, a Wardrobe, and a Great War, How World War I Inspired J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis to Recover Heroism, Friendship, and Faith for the Modern Age.
Yes.
Big topic.
A mouthful.
I like it. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
So why this topic? Let's just kind of start there.
Yeah. And as I'm sure your viewers know, this year marks the centennial of the beginning of the Great War, 1914 and 1918. So here we are, thinking 100 years later, still living with the effects of that war. And I didn't realize until recently that both those men, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, both served as soldiers in that war, fought in the Western Front, and survived. Lewis was injured. Tolkien contracted an illness. They didn't know each other going into the war. They met at Oxford as professors in 1926, and what began was a friendship that transformed both their lives.
That friendship did transform their lives, and for those who don't know, they were professors together at the same time.
Yeah.
How close were these two, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis?
Yeah, well, that's a terrific story, and I think part of the experience of war, the comradeship that you feel in wartime, the friendships that you form, it's nothing like it. And I think they had that sensibility when they went to Oxford. They wanted to somehow recapture something like that camaraderie. So once they became friends, got to know each other, they formed a group called the Inklings. Other scholars who had a love of literature, and they would gather together once or twice a week, usually in C.S. Lewis's rooms, and over a few drinks, a roaring fire, they would share each other's works, what they were working on, and critique each other, and argue, and encourage each other as a group. But also Tolkien and Lewis formed a very close friendship over those years, encouraging each other's works. I'll just mention one thing, Ben, we can come back to it. But Tolkien said, at different points in his life, he said he never would have started and finished The Lord of the Rings had it not been for Lewis's constant encouragement. He probably read every chapter of The Lord of the Rings out loud to C.S. Lewis.
So Lewis encouraged him to write that book, which obviously became what it became.
Yeah.
And at the same time, Tolkien, his influence on Lewis is profound.
It really was profound, yeah, because Lewis went into World War I as an atheist, and he came out an atheist. The war did not somehow create a spiritual revival for him or renewal for him. So when he meets Tolkien, Tolkien was a committed Catholic. And then the struggle that Lewis had, as many men had in that time, was, Christianity just seemed like another mythology. Not based on any fact, just a nice story, another myth. And Tolkien, who was very familiar with mythology, said, Lewis, yes, it has mythic elements, but Christianity, from Tolkien's perspective, it's the myth that became fact. The dying God who comes back to life. And when he talked about myth with Lewis, one late night conversation, I think in 1931, 32, they talked till 3 in the morning. And that discussion about myth, that was transformative for Lewis. And it opened up his thinking in a way that probably no other man could have opened up. And shortly after that, he became a Christian.
Tolkien's credited with having him become a Christian. That argument, that night, that discussion.
That's
and
right.
I don't know if that's legend or whatever.
No, it's true.
That's how close these two were.
Yeah.
And look how history was changed now that C.S. Lewis is changed in that way.
Because of that mutual respect. Lewis so respected Tolkien and his scholarship, his intellect. And I think C.S. Lewis needed someone who could speak to him at that level, at that intellectual level. And get through. There were other things going on as well. Lewis had a great friend during the war, Lawrence Johnson. And Johnson was not a Christian, but he was a theist. And they were fighting together in the trenches, and Lewis says in his journal, Johnson and I would have been lifelong friends had he not been killed in battle. And every time there was a break in the fighting, they would argue theology off the front. So he was, I think, a piece of the story as well as helping Lewis to think, here's a guy who is as smart as I am, maybe smarter, and he has this belief in God. Maybe I should think about my atheism. So, yeah.
And that aspect of their lives has been examined. Certainly the aspect at Oxford. What you're looking at here, and is so interesting, is the influence of the war.
That's right.
And let's just go back. World War I, it was devastating
Yes.
in so many ways. This was a new kind of war,
Yes.
and it opened the world's eyes to
Yes.
a new kind of destruction.
That's right.
And pain and just everything. I mean, what about World War
Yes.
I?
That's a great point, Ben. You got it exactly right. This is the mechanized slaughter on an industrialized scale. So, for example, you have about, on average, for the whole course of the war, 4 years, 6,046 men dying every day of that war for the length of the war. Just about 10 million, just under 10 million men dead, scores of millions more wounded. That doesn't even include civilians. So the world had never seen anything like it. And part of what helps us to understand the achievement of Tolkien and Lewis in writing these great stories of epic heroism in the context of war, nobody was writing stories like that in the 1920s and 30s and even into the 40s, because the war had such a devastating psychological effect, especially on Europeans. Not so much maybe Americans, but because the Europeans suffered so grievously in that war. And so the mood was disillusionment, doubt, lack of faith. I mean, many men and women losing their faith because of what the war had produced, because there were so many promises made about what this war could achieve, bringing about a better civilization, and it was just the reverse. So part of their achievement is realizing, hey, these guys are pushing back. They're pushing back against the cultural mood and mindset of their day, and they're saying, wait a minute, there still is such a thing as the heroic. There still is beauty. There still is God, there still is goodness, and they wanted to communicate those themes through their works. It's an amazing accomplishment.
And their works were fairy tales.
Yeah.
I mean, you
Yeah.
have The
Yeah.
Hobbit,
Yeah.
and you have The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe,
Yeah.
a talking lion.
That's right.
You know,
That's right.
it was a dark period,
Yeah.
and literature from that time is dark.
Yes, it's very dark.
And it's pessimistic.
Yeah.
And yet these two are
Yeah.
writing these fairy tales
Yeah.
with these clearly Christian undertones.
That's right.
And heavy undertones.
That's right.
But it's kind of wrapped up in this fairy tale story.
That's exactly right. Well, you know, T.S. Eliot is writing The Wasteland. You know, Dead Men's Bones. It's pretty bleak stuff. Tolkien and Lewis are writing these epic fairy tales. And the accusation against them, what critics often say is, look, these guys, they were trying to escape reality. So they're slipping into their little fantasy world, their mythic fantasy world. But Tolkien and Lewis said, no, real life has a mythical and heroic quality. And they could say that because they had seen that on the front, because they had seen men performing great acts of sacrifice and valor. It wasn't all black, and the war wasn't about nothing, I think, from their perspective. So if you view life that way, as having this kind of mythic and heroic quality, then it makes sense that you'd want to maybe use that genre of writing, the myth, and try to reinterpret it for the modern mind, and that's part of their great achievement, I think.
What was each of their roles in the war? How much action did they see?
Yeah.
And let's start with C.S. Lewis. I mean,
Yeah.
how much time was he fighting?
Yeah.
What about each one of them?
Yeah, you know, both of them were pretty reluctant recruits. Because by the time they got into the war, Tolkien in 1916, Lewis in 1917, you'd already had 2 years of slaughter. Millions of men were already dead. And so whatever enthusiasm men had going off to the war, and there was a lot initially, the promises that the war would be over by, you know, December of 1914, that's all nonsense. So these
That
guys,
happens in every war.
I
It's
guess-
like we're going to go off and win
Yeah.
it just overnight,
Yeah.
and then it's
Yeah.
not like that.
yeah, there was a kind of almost crusader mindset going in with some of these generals and all. But so Tolkien goes in first. He's older than Lewis. He goes in 1916, and he's in that war. He's not decommissioned until, you know, end of 1918, 1919. But he gets sick. He contracts trench fever. And that's in 1917. He contracts trench fever at the end of the year. So through 1918, when the fiercest battles are still going on, the springtime offensive that the Germans launch in 1918, Tolkien is in a hospital bed. And that trench fever probably saved his life because his battalion went on to fight, and most of it was wiped out.
Trench fever you get from lice.
Yeah.
And so that shows just how disgusting the circumstances were in which he was fighting.
Yes.
And so he's sent off to a hospital, and
Yeah.
then basically understands that everyone that was with him is dead.
Virtually everyone dead or missing in action in that final spring offensive, trying to beat back the Germans. And the trench life was just absolutely miserable. Rats everywhere, the water that would just collect in there, so the lice, the bugs, and the smell of death. That's the stench of death, men's bodies there. You can't maybe get them out to bury them. So it was just a wretched, wretched thing. Lewis comes in 1917, and also a very reluctant recruit. He sees about 6 intensive months of trench warfare, and he's injured. A shell goes off pretty close, maybe 30, 40 feet away. It kills his sergeant, injures him in 3 different places, and he carries a piece of shrapnel near his heart, in his chest for the rest of his life. But it was the best kind of wound you could have gotten, because it wasn't life debilitating, but it got you out of the combat. It got you off the front line. And so he was recuperating in a hospital during 1918, again, through the worst of it. And that wound saved his life.
And
probably.
these two didn't meet on the front,
Not
right?
during the war, no. Did not know each other during the war. They met at Oxford, you know, by the, you could call it providence, the grace of God. These two lovers of myth and lovers of medieval writing and literature, they meet and this friendship forms. But the war experience was really formative, and it seemed to me that there had not been enough written about that. And people who love Tolkien and Lewis, and I love them as well, I don't think appreciated how that war influenced their literary imagination. And we can talk about it some more, but that was really profound for me.
Well, I want to talk about that. We have to take a break, then we'll come back. How did that war influence the stuff we still read today? All right, we'll take a break. Be back right after this.